Launch on demand within 8 hours of an unanticipated demand and launches through 99.9% of winds aloft. It's an all-composite vehicle, and so it is remarkably stiff. It's scalable to larger ones as well. We think that on the whole, again, this has also been independently verified in terms of both the technology and the cost by an independent panel that was funded by the Air Force to do it. But again, there are obviously a variety of small launch vehicle programs out there. We think this one at least has some valuable characteristics associated with it that gets us to where we can in fact put small satellites into orbit essentially on demand. And if they're going to become operational rather than experimental, that's the sort of thing that we need to have happen. So that's a quick summary of microcosm technologies and what we think is the case for small satellites. This just, by the way, summarizes what we think the problem is that we're trying to resolve. That's what we call the space spiral over there in the lower right-hand corner. The space spiral suggests that if you have higher costs, what happens, that brings in longer schedules, fewer missions, a demand for higher reliability, which is usually parts reliability actually. That of course drives you to higher cost, and that drives you to fewer missions, and so on and so forth, and that's where we're going. And it's clear that's the process that we have to somehow turn around. And we think that small satellites can help turn that around, can help reverse that space spiral to get us into something that makes a great deal more sense, where we can have more missions, lower cost, less risk, but less mission risk, and therefore more accommodating of individual spacecraft failures that might occur. As has been pointed out earlier, we don't want missions that last 15 years. If it takes 12 or 14 years to build it, as you were pointing out, you have it last for 15 years on orbit. Now when you're done, you've got 30-year-old technology. If that was what our cell phone had, it would still have a cord on it. You know, it doesn't make any sense. We don't want that kind of technology. We want to be able to update it very frequently in order to make this occur in a way that makes sense so we can introduce new technology. And that's what we can do with a small sat model. That's it.
Half an hour for discussion now, and we really wanted to use discussion. As we started this morning with the opening over in the ballroom, we talked about stirring the pot. We want to do that. I want to open it up for the audience to ask questions. I'm telling you, I'm thinking about the fact I'm former Army intel, and I remember reading in the history of Army that there was a time when somebody had an idea about rifled barrels, and most of the leadership of the Army back then, at that moment in time, said, why would we need that? And fought it. You know, if we talk about the innovator's dilemma as you move through time, here we are now. You can see that this is not just junk sats, junk science. It's real. So I'd like to now find anybody in the audience have a question you want to start with, and then Skunk, you know, you'll be stirring the pot as well. Anybody? Why don't you get people just?
You think about people like Billy Mitchell and people like that. Those people gave up their personal lives and their reputations to actually get something done, so the rifle barrels, the aircraft, etc. But one thing and I'll address this to everybody, and by the way, the audience, feel free to jump in. Fisticuffs are not allowed, but everybody else can do whatever they want. And if you want to discuss amongst yourself, feel free. The commercial sector is driven a lot of different things, and I'm a big fan of it. If I were a reinsurance company and I was starting to think about what would happen after a solar event when much of the world goes back to the 18th century, I'd start to think real hard about how I could maintain my business model and how I could operate while most of the world is still trading in rabbit skins. Could I stay viable? Could my banking, insurance, my ability to support not only the civilian sector, but the military sector? How would I do that? And it sounds like the ability to reconstitute on a civilian level, and certainly on a military level, sounds like a viable option. How would, and I've asked people on the panel and also in the audience, how would you go about convincing the business community that this is in their best interest?
Yeah, so I don't think you have to convince the business community. We've gotten a very warm reception with Munich Re and the other very large reinsurance companies around the globe, far more so than I thought we would. Our greatest challenge is in convincing the governments of the world because all meteorological satellites are owned by the governments of the world, and there's no desire for the model to change, really institutionally, and the behavior much like the NRO 13 years ago. But look at the benefits that it's brought. The warfighter, which is the most important person in the chain, right? And I think you'll see that same benefit when it comes to improving the forecast. But, you know, it's wonderful actually to see that businesses have to be resilient. And they don't really care where the data comes from. Sure, they'd rather get it for free, but they no longer believe the governments of the world are going to keep pace with innovation, and they cannot risk their business. So back to that, you know, seesaw, that teeter-totter I showed, the risk to them of not being prepared for risk, which they see coming, is too great to rely on government. And that's going to drive the model.
So Skunk, I think was part of your question about a business that's currently involved in building the large sats, and how do you move a company like that to think that on the horizon changes in the wind. You know, it's going to happen. How do we move more quickly? What's the business incentive for a large company that builds the large birds to be able to move more towards smaller disaggregated? Is that what you were referring to?
Well, and that's part of it. And I always use the example of having many, many years in the rock and roll business. It used to cost a lot to make records. Anybody remember a song called My Sharona? You know how much it cost to make that whole album? $11,000. That means that somebody, instead of spending a whole lot of money, said, you know, where's the art part of this? And I think the art part of this comes from brilliant engineers, people who are driven to do things with less money and smaller budgets. So why would a large company then want to, how would you incentivize a large company to say, okay, instead of charging $100 bazillion for a satellite, what is the driver to get a large company to do that? How would you convince them?
Well, I've got a couple of comments on that. So I think it's been mentioned a number of times that it's really about the data and the availability of the data to the end user. And one of my favorite stories is, and I have a little bit too much gray in my beard to have to saying this, but GPS is a good example. GPS was debated for many, many years. I don't know if many people knew this, but it was canceled almost every year for like a 5 or 8 year period because it was just too phenomenal to think you had these, you know, precision nuclear clocks floating around the Earth telling you where you were. Nowadays, people don't even know that they can live without GPS. You can't walk around with a mobile device. There are kids that don't understand why you have to spend money to build a GPS satellite because they have it on their phone. So it's actually gotten to a point where it has been so commoditized that people don't understand the full implications. But those are very complex, expensive systems, and they have some real hard science that went into them. As far as moving those large corporations to be more motivated for small satellites, Rob and I were talking about this earlier, I think the realities of the budget constraints are palatable. They've got to recognize that. I think there's always going to be a real need and an appropriate intent for very large, complex sensors and systems. But if you had to do all of your 5 different types of missions you might want to do, I think rethinking it now, you can't afford to do them the expensive way anymore. So if 2 of them just needed to be a big bird satellite, you might want to figure out alternatives for the other missions. So if you could start offloading it to Planet IQ and Planet Labs, I would take a serious look at that. And then you can go make the case. Now I need my multi-billion-dollar program because we can't do that with those other systems. The other thing I was going to say was that Rob pointed out that when you go through your architecture analysis for these systems, you look at how much coverage you have of the Earth, the swath width, the power requirements, what altitude you're at. There's all kinds of things you look at. Now that we're getting less expensive capabilities, more capable, smaller packages, and launch opportunities that are coming into the fold, that architectural analysis now has shifted because you can now say, look, I can actually launch 100 small satellites instead of 8 larger ones, and I get this for that money instead of this, but now I can do that because very few satellite companies ever survive trying to do the Iridium size constellation. So I think the economics have moved to do that, and now if you launch 100, you might be close to the similar price tag to sustain a large, bureaucracy, because you're launching more. But now you're looking at it from a system perspective. You see the entire impact of that system and what that system is doing for giving you persistence. Persistence seems to be something that is talked about a lot.
Would you think the reinsurance companies, since the reinsurance companies run the world, I learned that a long time ago, would a reinsurance company be interested in saying, well, company X, if you're willing to invest in some small satellites as backups for, say, a coronal event or something like that, we're going to lower your insurance premiums. Do things like that work in the business community?
There's another element that's required in all of this. If I'm going to have reconstitution of assets for any reason at all, one of the things that I need is the ability to respond quickly, of course. And that in turn, I think, implies a different business model. Today, on the whole, you build something, and as soon as you build it, you launch it, because it's a really expensive asset. When you drive down the cost of the asset, both the launch vehicle and the spacecraft, then you can do build, inventory, and launch on demand. And of course, that's exactly what you do with everything else in the world, with airplanes or cars or trains. Who cares how long it takes to build a car or an airplane? All I care is one available on the lot when I want to go buy one at some level. It's the same sort of thing you'd like to have here. That's what you need for reconstitution of assets, but it's also what you need for a different class of mission as well. And that is to say, emergency response kinds of things. You're trying to find an airplane that got lost in the South Indian Ocean. Okay? You want to be able to launch an asset that can in fact cover that area much more frequently, much more easily. Russia decides to invade a neighboring country somewhere. Okay? Not that that would ever occur, of course. But, that's the sort of thing you would like to be able to launch assets in response to. It is technically remarkably doable. Recall 1982, the Falklands War. The Soviet Union launched 29 payloads in 69 days in direct response to the Falklands War. The United States cannot do that today, and that's not a good thing. We want to be able to provide that kind of capability.
Jim, let me tie several of your comments together with a question for the audience, maybe from the audience. How many people in the room, your focus is either defense, intelligence, or homeland security? Show of hands. So the vast majority of the people in the room are focused on those. So you start with the end user need, right? And then times threat, times budget, and so on. From an end user need, and if we look at the threat environment, it seems to me like we've seen a lot in the last couple of years. In fact, from the president and his national space policy in 2010, where he said we have to be able to operate through a contested environment, and he meant a near peer who likely can use cyber or kinetic against us. We saw the commander of SpaceCom just 6 weeks ago at George Washington University, General Shelton, talk about the challenge in that regard. From a national perspective, it seems like there's been a fairly clear statement that we need to be able to supplement and complement national technical means in extremis from a national standpoint, cyber or kinetic. From a tactical standpoint, it seems like we've heard from the tactical users over and over and over for years that while national technical means are enormously powerful and capable, when the stuff's hitting the fan, they need something that's going to be optimized for their need. They must think this way, otherwise you wouldn't have the commander of SMDC down in Huntsville spending energy and money and resources to move forward on tactical satellites that are aimed at Army needs. So you've got an end user, a national end, you've got a tactical end, you've got Army coming off the Green Ramp at Fort Bragg, may have to do a forced entry, and there may not be ISR surge forward like there has been for 12, 13 years now. You've got, so my question is, you've got an end user need, you've got threat, and you've got the budget problem. So what's the holdup, gang? You're on the panel and in the audience. I mean, what do you see the boulder that needs to be moved, and how do you move it?
I would argue at least that there are many people, obviously the government is not a monolithic whole in any sense at all. There are a large number of people that are convinced of the value and of the need for small satellites, quick response, and so on and so forth. But equally clearly, I think, if you look at the character of the government collectively, the way the government speaks is by spending money. And look at the amount of money the government is putting into dumping into small satellites to building them today. And that pile is not very deep. It is remarkably shallow. That is to say, the decision-making process thus far is not gotten to the point where it's recognized either the capability or the value of doing that. There is still a very strong commitment to traditional large satellites, I believe, within the decision-making authority in the government.
And why do you think that's the case still today?
Oh, I agree 100%. I mean, I think there is an aversion to risk in the government workforce. I think inertia is a really big problem. And I do think the business model is changing. And I think some of the institutions and corporations who have been building pristine billion-dollar systems are also very concerned about the changing business model. So I have spent, in the last 10 months, I've had probably 170 meetings on the Hill. I've gotten thousands of dollars in parking tickets. And I have gotten a great reception on both sides of the Hill. Gratefully, you know, weather is a nonpartisan issue, and this country faces a big problem. But I also know that some of those very large companies that are very vested in those $3 and $4 billion systems have been in there the day before me countering my argument. So, you know, and this is beautiful, you know, it's industry, we're at work here, right? It's capitalism. We get to disagree, hopefully in a very factual way. But I think this changing business model is not only threatening to government employees for all the issues that I think we all know, but I think it's also threatening to another part of industry. So it would be disingenuous of us to sit up here and say it worked, right?
So questions from the audience. Here we go, sir, over here.
So when talking about changing this dynamic, you're requesting that the government workforce or anybody representing that to change the way that they think. But what I haven't seen yet in learning about small sets is, so what's a life expectancy? How do you properly plan a program with multiple sensors instead of, you know, large sensors? But how do you plan that from a logistical piece? What's your life cycle on your small set? How do you plan that, and how do you educate the workforce that way?
So I think our businesses are a little bit different that
Sure.
way. So
Sure.
our businesses are sourced from aerospace companies, and our lifespan design is 7 years.
Okay.
And our build is about $8.5 million per satellite. And I think that's important in particular. I think, you know, the businesses we're in are in different stages, imagery versus atmospheric science. And all of my customers are scientists. They're atmospheric scientists, and they want precision. And so we have to hit a different hurdle. We also have to have fuel on board to make sure that we're in the right orbits with all 12. And at $8.5 million, we have to have a design life that's greater than 2 years.
Yeah, I was going to point out that Planet IQ is more of the traditional architecture, and when you have a constellation of that size, I think they still call it gap analysis, don't they? So when one of those systems doesn't arrive on orbit or it fails prematurely, you have a gap, and those gaps, we become very used to this data, and so there's this term resiliency we've been talking about. We need much more resilient systems because we're too accustomed to this information being available, and it becomes really painful when you actually have one of these systems go out, and now you have these periods of time when you don't see it. That's not only, you know, critically important for the warfighter, but these systems now have to be resilient because they're embedded in our daily lives, and they will have tremendous economic impact on the nation if we start having major economic hits that are going to affect our ability to move forward. To your point, talking about, you know, these systems, you have to think about it a little bit differently, and I think we have to go prove it. I think that's the problem. There's a lot of really smart people that have some very good arguments against this. So you can argue all day. So you have to go out and actually just do it and prove that these things actually have a foothold. So I like the whole Silicon Valley. You know, we're going to try, and maybe it won't work perfect, but we're going to try it again. But looking at that systems architecture, you have to look at the whole system and the entire long-term life cycle of what that business plan is, because now you have this replenishment capability that's dialed in. It's not the satellite lasting longer. I don't know what the business plan is, but they could have a 12-year business plan and they've accounted for all of this. What I like about it is you also are going to be taking advantage of critical advancements in new technologies that now can be embedded and put up there within a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, not waiting 10 or 12 or 18. And then you've also got this resilience factor that the data, you know, if one of them is not working quite right, you've got more options and you're going to have a better chance of having that data available to at least a portion of your users.
So Andy, what you're saying is that people wouldn't be okay with keeping the same model of iPhone for 7, 8, 9 years? So the replenishment rate, right, the refresh technology, there's actually a downside to having a program last those years, right?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and combining it with the one before about how to change really the procurement cycle of government in order to take on something that has more risk, but potentially greater reward if it comes up, it's a matter of, from our perspective, who's our first customers. And actually we have traction in the commercial industry, where these type of data would be a differentiator for some of our customers, so they're willing to go to market with us, knowing that this makes sense. The resilience of the organization and the data continuity across different generations of sensors. And so we don't have a contract with the U.S. government. Right? It's in agriculture and in mapping and in value-added service providers that see that this actually could happen. And with these satellites that come online, and then about a quarter later with other satellites that come online, then we actually prove the data continuity across it and get to imagery on demand to a point where then we have a product that is resilient and robust, and some of the risk has been taken out of it by the commercial sector.
Daryl, I saw your hand in the back.
Can I respond to this one once before? Sure. I would argue that you have, in fact, much lower risk with a set of small satellites. If you, at this point, have a relatively small number of large satellites, if those large satellites, 1 or 2 of them, in fact, disappear for any reason, they run into a piece of debris you can't see, it's going to be many years before those are replaced, certainly long beyond any immediate need you have for them. On the other hand, with a set of small satellites, you may well have, for example, take the Iridium constellation, have spares on orbit, ready to go. So in fact, if you lose a satellite, you don't lose performance. Okay, you still have the system performance there available. And in fact, you have replacement satellites available so that you can launch them essentially immediately. You do need to have build inventory and launch on demand. Those are 2 key characteristics. You can do that when you drive down the cost. The cost of a satellite at a few $1 million or so, or a launch vehicle at a few $1 million, sitting in your warehouse is around $10,000 a month. You got to borrow the money from somebody to go do that after all. So it's going to cost you about that amount of money. And that's not a dramatic cost in terms of having that asset available to you. So in fact, you can drive the risk down substantially, where by risk you mean, is the data available to the end user? It's not whether or not that particular satellite is alive, because any satellite can get killed for a number of reasons. It's whether or not I can get the data to the end user when they need it.
Daryl?
Okay, so my question is, really speaks more to the FUD factor of small sats. And when we talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt, you know, some of it's planted by established folks in the space business. And I'm curious, in terms of both a CalVal or a VMV's, programs that you all have, how do you plan on dealing with some of those it's not good enough kind of fear, uncertainty, doubt ideas as you roll out your respective data sets to the global community?
Yeah, this is part of the reason why we're going to the government as a second customer. It's the nicest way to say it. It's because we can iterate on the image quality, right? And if you think about the end-to-end complicated systems architecture that we have of ground stations everywhere, mission control, dozens of spacecraft, and all this imagery, and automated image processing, and exposing that to the web, and then keep launching these things, and getting your, having cash flow working, getting your licenses and so forth. It's actually pretty complex, and we have that working now. So now we can make it more resilient, more robust, more scalable, and we can iterate based on what the commercial market wants, and the government should become part of that commercial market. And so if they're willing to pay for a certain type of image quality, then that's actually a business decision for us in order to iterate our spacecraft design in order to meet that image quality.
So in our case, we are partially owned by a company called Broadreach Engineering, which has now been purchased by Moog. Broadreach Engineering has built 20 GPS radio occultation sensors on orbit, more than anyone else ever has, and they are considered the gold standard of GPS radio occultation sensors. So that's a little bit of buying down those who are skeptical. And then the other part is there is a research constellation that's operating today by the Taiwanese government called COSMIC. That data is processed by the University Consortium for Atmospheric Research, which is located in Boulder, Colorado. And we are in negotiations with UCAR to also develop our ground processing systems. And that's the right thing to do, I think, for the user community as well, because the Taiwanese system will continue to operate, and making sure there's calibration between the Taiwanese data and Planet IQ data is fundamental. So that's how we've dealt with that.
So we have time for one more question. I think there, yes, sir. Right here with your hand up, yes, sir. You.
All right. So I think the panel or the audience asked the question is, there's a risk. Why nobody actually take the risk and expand the business? I think there are two factors. One is the technology demonstration. To what extent the technology is proved reliable, people is willing to give the instrument a lot. For example, if I have $1 million instrument, I may not be able to find insurance say, okay, if the satellite fall, it's my pay the check. Okay, I but if the logic can say we launched 100, we have 95% reliability, that's a confidence. So my first, I think, is what level technology prove it's to a certain extent, and we can use the small satellite. Second is a business model. As Anne pointed out, is there's critical data doesn't matter if it's DOE or civil use. For example, she pointed out there is a 53 months data gap, right? And at that time, CNN will sign her satellite to provide the weather. Everybody will use. The insurance company will sign and say, okay, based on the data, how we actually will price the insurance. So I think if we can consider these two factors, technology, demonstration, and business model, there's a possibility we can actually expand this business. Right now, it's kind of on paper say, yes, it's a low cost to build and launch satellite. How about the server's cost, right? So that should be considered one package.
Yeah, so I think I spoke to the data with the sensors we're flying have been proven. They're the gold standard. Every forecast agency around the globe and private forecast agencies around the globe want a lot more of it. But so I may not have fully understood your question, but here's a big difference in the business model. We are not asking for a single penny from any government around the globe in advance of launch. So if those things blow up, that's Planet IQ's problem, right? There is $64 million in our business model for 2 launches, one as a secondary ride, 2 as the second one as a primary ride, and the insurance. That whole event lasts 30 minutes, and it's $64 million, which is ludicrous, right? But there is no risk to any government around the world, because we're not asking for any upfront money, which is very dissimilar from the imagery world in the clear view, next view, and enhanced view contract. That is a radical difference. And that's something that's actually working to our favor in these budget times, because this gap is going to show up. probably after this administration, but this administration has to plan for this gap now, right? And we're not asking them to put money on the table, we're asking them to sign a non-binding letter of intent. And then I think the other issue is the requirements of the future are not gonna come from, government is not going to have the strongest requirements of the future, the private sector is. You look at how much is at risk with weather every day, and if there were a solar flare, $3.5 trillion in economic damage to the United States of America alone. And there is no risk mitigation strategy in place. So Duke Power is interested, SCE&G is interested, Chesapeake Bay is interested. A lot of big name companies, John Deere, on and on and on. That is too much risk. The requirements of the future for weather are going to be driven by the private sector, not by the governments around the globe. But the governments will benefit. And most importantly, the forecast. Every citizen on the globe deserves a great forecast. So the model is changing, at least in the weather world.
And analogous to that as we close out is, who would have thought that 800 million people a day would be using something called Google Earth? Those are, when we're not talking about intelligence analysts, 800 million people around the world using that kind of a head tool, if you will. Panelists, thank you for your insights today. We really appreciate it. I'm sure all of the panelists are willing to meet later on and talk to you over the course of the next few days. Thanks, everybody.